You ever feel like you're drowning in plain sight and nobody even notices? Like you're smiling, cracking jokes, being the hype friend everybody loves. But inside, you're straight up collapsing piece by piece, and the mask is the only thing keeping you together. That's the thing about trauma nobody talks about. It doesn't always look broken. Sometimes it looks like the strongest person in the room. Mike Guy is the perfect example of this. Everyone sees the energy, the confidence, the power of youth speeches, but what they don't see is the quiet destruction happening underneath all of it. The guilt that's eating him alive. The fear of failing that's been running his entire life. And honestly, if you've ever pushed yourself to the edge just to prove you're worthy, you already know exactly what I'm about to unpack. Because this isn't just about anime. This is about the hidden psychology of people who smile the hardest while they're breaking the most. Here's what's messed up about guilt: it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly rewires how you see yourself until one day you realize you're not even living for you anymore. You're living to prove something, to fix something, to make up for something that probably wasn't even your fault to begin with. And the crazy part? You don't even notice it happening. You just wake up one day and realize you've been running on fumes for years, and you can't even remember when you last felt okay. That's where Guy lived. In that space between "I'm fine" and complete emotional collapse. And look, if this is hitting you a little too hard right now, that's not an accident. Because if you see yourself in Guy, even just a little, that means you're exactly the type of person I make these breakdowns for. So before I dive even deeper into the psychology behind why he carries all this guilt, do one thing for yourself real quick. Hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Not for me, but so you don't miss the kind of videos that finally explain the stuff you've been feeling your whole life but never had words for. Because if you're tired of pretending you're good, if you're done being the strong one while nobody sees you breaking, you're gonna want to be here for what comes next. Alright, let's keep going. People look at Mike Guy and see this dude who's all energy, all passion, all drive, like he's the human embodiment of never giving up. But that's exactly why his story cuts so deep when you actually pay attention. Because that kind of relentless positivity, that's not always strength. Sometimes it's the most sophisticated defense mechanism your brain can build. Let me break it down for you. Guy's entire sense of self was built on one core belief: I can't fail. I don't get to fail. Failure isn't an option for me. And when that kind of thinking becomes your identity, guilt stops being an emotion. It becomes your operating system. You carry it everywhere. You wear it like a second skin. Even when nobody's blaming you for anything, you're blaming yourself for everything. That's how trauma disguises itself in high-functioning people. See, Guy's guilt wasn't tied to one specific moment or one catastrophic event. It was way more insidious than that. It was built from patterns, from years of conditioning, from a mindset that got wired into him so early he probably doesn't even remember when it started. It was the fear of letting people down. The fear of not being enough. The fear of being the weak link. Or worse, the fear of being responsible for someone else's suffering. And when that fear takes root, your brain starts doing something really messed up. It starts disconnecting you from your own needs, your own pain, your own limits. Psychologists call this dissociation, but in everyday terms, it's when you stop checking in with yourself because you've convinced yourself that your feelings don't matter as much as everyone else's. You think pushing harder is the solution. You think if you just work more, train more, give more, sacrifice more, then maybe, just maybe, you'll finally be enough. That's called hyperfunctioning, and it's one of the brain's most deceptive survival strategies. You avoid facing your pain by drowning it in productivity, in effort, in constant motion. As long as you're moving, you don't have to feel. As long as you're achieving, you don't have to acknowledge what's breaking inside. Guy lived in that state for years. Decades probably. Every loud joke, every enthusiastic speech, every over-the-top display of confidence was a distraction. Not for other people, for himself. He needed the noise because the silence was too heavy. He needed the performance because sitting still meant confronting truths he wasn't ready to face. And here's the kicker. This is exactly how people with depression and anxiety function in the real world. You keep showing up. You keep being the reliable one, the strong one, the positive one, because the thought of disappointing someone, of being seen as weak, of admitting you're struggling, that terrifies you more than the idea of destroying yourself in the process. You'd rather break in private than let anyone see you're not okay. Now let's talk about Lee. Because Guy's relationship with Rock Lee is where all of this gets brutally real. On the surface, it looks like this beautiful mentor-student bond, right? Guy sees himself in Lee. He trains him, believes in him, pushes him to greatness. It's inspiring as hell. But when you look deeper, when you understand the psychology behind it, you realize Guy wasn't just training Lee. He was trying to save a version of himself that he never got to be. Every time Lee failed, Guy felt it like a personal failure. Every risk Lee took felt like a reminder of Guy's own insecurities. Every time Lee got hurt, every time he pushed too far, every time he came close to ending his career, Guy's guilt got louder. That's emotional projection. It's when you unconsciously place your own unresolved pain onto someone else's situation. You blame yourself for things you couldn't control because, in your mind, guilt feels safer than accepting the truth. You're not God. You're not responsible for every outcome. You're human and humans have limits. But guilt doesn't let you believe that. Guilt tells you every mistake is personal. Every setback is proof you didn't do enough. Every bad outcome is evidence that you're fundamentally flawed. Guy carried that weight for years, probably his entire life. And most people never noticed because they confused his effort with emotional health. They saw the power of youth, energy, and assumed he was thriving. They didn't see the anxiety underneath, the desperation, the constant internal pressure to prove he was worthy of existing. That's the thing about silent trauma. It hides under performance. It hides under responsibility. It hides under being the person everyone can count on. And here's the really dark part. The stronger the mask, the deeper the wounds behind it. Guy wasn't inspiring because he was naturally confident. He was inspiring because he fought a war inside himself every single day, and never let anyone see it. He turned his pain into fuel, his fear into motivation, his guilt into a reason to keep pushing. But that kind of survival strategy has an expiration date. Because you can only run from yourself for so long before your body and mind force you to stop. His guilt wasn't a single moment. It wasn't something he could just get over or move past. It was a journey. A slow, grinding transformation that he didn't choose but had to carry anyway. And it shaped every decision he made, every relationship he built, every risk he took. The scariest part? He probably thought he was managing it. He probably thought the constant effort, the constant training, the constant focus on others, was him being strong. But strength and survival aren't the same thing. And sometimes what looks like resilience is actually just exhaustion wearing a brave face. And here's where it gets real heavy, no cap. People think Guy had control over his life. They think he was this self-made hero who chose his path, who built himself up from nothing through sheer willpower and determination. But control? That was the biggest lie he ever told himself. It's the same illusion Kaneki from Tokyo Ghoul clung to, telling himself he was handling it, that he was managing the darkness, that he had everything under control, while he was literally fracturing into different personalities just to survive. The same delusion Shinji from Evangelion bought into, thinking that running away, that avoiding pain, that staying small would somehow keep him safe. The same trap Eren from Attack on Titan fell headfirst into, believing he was steering the story, that he was making choices, that he had agency, when really his trauma was driving every single decision he made. Guy believed his guilt made him stronger. He genuinely thought that carrying all that weight, that pressure, that responsibility, was what pushed him to greatness. But guilt doesn't build strength. Guilt builds chains. Invisible ones that you don't even realize you're wearing until you try to move freely and find out you can't. He pushed harder, trained harder, risked harder, not because he felt powerful, not because he was confident in his abilities, but because the thought of failing Lee felt unbearable. The idea of letting down his student, his legacy, the kid who believed in him when nobody else did, that terror was so intense it overrode every other instinct, including self-preservation. And that's when the real collapse starts happening, when your entire sense of worth becomes dependent on someone else's success or survival. When you can't separate their pain from your responsibility. When their struggles feel like proof of your inadequacy. If you've ever felt personally responsible for someone else's healing, if you've ever carried guilt for someone else's choices, if you've ever believed that their pain was somehow your fault even though logically you know it wasn't, you already know exactly where this is heading. Because here's what nobody tells you about that kind of emotional entanglement. It doesn't just drain you. It fundamentally alters how you see yourself. You stop being a person with your own needs, your own boundaries, your own life. You become a function, a tool, a means to an end. And the wildest part? You do it to yourself. Nobody forces you. You volunteer for it because deep down, some part of you believes that's what love looks like. That's what loyalty means. That's what being strong requires. But that's not strength. That's self-destruction dressed up as virtue. Guy spent years, literal years, operating from this place. Every decision filtered through the same question. Will this prove I'm enough? Will this make up for my inadequacies? Will this finally silence the voice in my head telling me I'm not worthy? And the answer was always no. Because that voice? It's not looking for evidence. It's not interested in facts. It's running on fear, on trauma, on beliefs that got coded into your nervous system before you even had the language to question them. That's the thing about guilt-based living, it's never satisfied. You can achieve everything you set out to do and still feel like a failure because the goalpost keeps moving. The standard keeps rising. The bar keeps getting higher. You're not chasing success at that point. You're running from a feeling. And you can't outrun your own nervous system. So Guy kept pushing, kept training, kept sacrificing, kept pretending that the pain was temporary, that the struggle was worth it, that eventually he'd reach some finish line where he could finally rest and feel okay about himself. But that finish line doesn't exist. Not when you're running from trauma. Not when guilt is your compass. The only destination is collapse. And his came during the war. Not because he wasn't strong enough, but because he'd been operating at a deficit for so long that his body and mind literally had nothing left to give. Opening the 8th gate wasn't just a tactical decision. It was the physical manifestation of how he'd been living his entire life. Burning himself up completely with no regard for what comes after, as long as he could protect the people he loved. As long as he could prove one final time that he was enough. But here's the part that'll mess you up if you really sit with it. Even in that moment, even when he was literally dying, even when he'd given everything he possibly could, do you think the guilt went away? Do you think he finally felt like he'd done enough? Or do you think, somewhere in the back of his mind, there was still that voice asking, could I have done more? Should I have been better? Is this really enough? That's the cruelest part of living with that kind of trauma. There is no amount of sacrifice that satisfies it. There is no achievement big enough to silence it. There is no proof strong enough to convince it. Because it's not logical. It's not rational. It's a wound. And wounds don't heal through more pain. They heal through acknowledgement, through rest, through gentleness. Things Guy never gave himself. Things he probably didn't even know he needed. Wild how the person who fights the hardest is usually the one who's been at war with themselves the longest, huh? You're gonna want to hear what comes next, because this is the part most people never connect. The part that explains why so many of us live exactly like Guy did without even realizing it. Here's the truth that nobody wants to say out loud. Guy didn't break because he was weak. He didn't collapse because he lacked discipline or willpower or heart. He broke because he spent decades carrying guilt that was never his to begin with. Let that sink in for a second. That's what silent trauma does to you. It convinces you that you're responsible for things you never controlled. It makes you believe you failed people you actually saved. It tricks you into thinking you could have done more when you already gave everything humanly possible. The dark truth behind Guy's suffering isn't the 8 gates. It isn't his rivalry with Kakashi. It isn't even the war or Madara or any of the external battles he fought. It's the emotional identity he built around guilt. He believed pain was the price of love. He believed suffering was the cost of protecting others. He believed destroying himself was the only way to prove he mattered, that he had value, that he deserved to exist. That's the hidden truth that runs through so many people's lives without them ever naming it. We punish ourselves for wounds we didn't cause. Think about it. How many times have you apologized for things that weren't your fault? How many times have you taken responsibility for someone else's emotions, their choices, their pain? How many times have you told yourself, I should have known better, I should have done more, I should have been different, when the reality is you did the best you could with what you had at the time? That's the pattern. That's the cycle. And it's the same one Guy lived in his entire life. See, what most people don't understand about guilt is that it's not actually about the present. It's about the past. It's your nervous system trying to retroactively change outcomes that already happened. It's your brain convinced that if you just feel bad enough, try hard enough, sacrifice enough, somehow you can go back and fix what's already done. But you can't. And that's where the suffering compounds. Because when you're stuck in that loop, when guilt is your operating system, you stop living in reality. You start living in hypotheticals. In what-ifs, and should-haves, and alternate timelines that don't exist. You torture yourself with versions of the past where you were somehow better, smarter, stronger, more aware. Guy did this with Lee. He replayed every training session, every fight, every injury, every close call, wondering if he pushed too hard, if he didn't push hard enough, if he set Lee up for failure by giving him hope, if he failed him by teaching him techniques that could kill him. None of those thoughts were based in reality. Lee made his own choices. Lee chose the path of taijutsu knowing the risks. Lee pushed himself because that's who he is, not because Guy forced him. But guilt doesn't care about reality. Guilt rewrites history to make you the villain of every story. And here's where it gets even darker. People living with this kind of guilt don't just need someone to tell them, it's not your fault. That doesn't work. Because on a logical level they already know that. They can intellectually understand that they're not responsible for everything. But trauma isn't stored in the logical part of your brain. It's stored in your nervous system, in your body, in the automatic responses that kick in before you even have time to think. So what they actually need, what Guy needed, isn't forgiveness from others. It's not validation or reassurance or even success. It's clarity. Clarity about where their responsibility actually ends and where other people's begins. Clarity about the difference between caring for someone and being responsible for their entire existence. Clarity about the fact that you can love someone deeply, support them completely, give them everything you have, and they can still suffer. They can still struggle. They can still get hurt. And that's not your failure. That's just life. That's the human condition. That's what it means to exist in a world where we don't have control over outcomes, only over our own actions. But if you were raised to believe that love means taking responsibility for other people's pain, if you learned early on that your value is determined by how much you sacrifice, if you were taught that boundaries are selfish and self-care is weak, then that clarity feels impossible to reach. Because accepting it would mean dismantling your entire identity. It would mean admitting that the version of strength you've been performing your whole life was actually just survival. It would mean acknowledging that the mask you've been wearing wasn't protecting anyone, it was slowly suffocating you. And that realization? That's terrifying. Because if you're not the person who saves everyone, if you're not the one who carries all the weight, if you're not responsible for fixing everything, then who are you? That's the existential crisis sitting at the core of Guy's character. And it's the same crisis sitting at the core of everyone who relates to him. We don't know who we are without the guilt. We don't know how to exist without the pressure. We don't know what our life looks like if we're not constantly proving our worth through suffering. And that unknown? That's scarier than the pain we already know. So we keep running. We keep pushing. We keep pretending we're fine while we're falling apart internally. Until something forces us to stop. Until our body gives out, or our mind breaks, or life hits us with something so overwhelming that the mask finally cracks. For Guy, that moment was the 8th gate. But for most people, it's a breakdown that nobody sees coming. It's the burnout that hits after years of grinding. It's the panic attack that comes out of nowhere. It's the moment where you realize you've been running on empty for so long you forgot what full even feels like. And in that moment you have a choice. You can either keep trying to rebuild the same mask, the same identity, the same patterns, or you can finally ask yourself the question you've been avoiding your whole life. What if I don't have to live like this? What if guilt isn't love? What if suffering isn't strength? What if I'm allowed to exist without constantly proving I deserve to? That's the revelation. That's the plot twist. That's the truth that changes everything. You were never the problem. The guilt was. The belief system was. The identity you built around pain was. And the person you could become without it? That's someone you've never even met. But here's the part that stays with you long after the story ends, the part that keeps you up at night if you really let it sink in. Guy's story doesn't end with heroism. It doesn't end with the battlefield or the epic fight or even the moment he opened the 8th gate. Those are just the visible parts, the parts everyone remembers, the parts that get celebrated and talked about and turned into inspiration porn. The real ending happens in the quiet space after everything settles. When the adrenaline fades and the crowds disappear and the noise finally stops. When you're left alone in that hospital bed or that empty room or that moment right before sleep, and you have to sit with the truth you've been running from your entire life. That's where the real darkness lives. Not in the battles. Not in the sacrifices. Not in the dramatic moments everyone sees. But in the silence after them. In that space where you finally have to ask yourself, was it worth it? Did I prove what I needed to prove? Am I finally enough? And the most brutal part? For people like Guy, for people who've built their entire identity around guilt and proving their worth through pain, the answer is never yes. Because the question itself is broken. Because you can't earn your way out of trauma. You can't achieve your way into feeling worthy. You can't sacrifice enough to finally silence that voice. Guy survived the war, but did he survive the guilt? Did opening the 8th gate finally give him the peace he was looking for? Or did he just trade one form of suffering for another? The physical limitations, the wheelchair, the loss of the life he knew, the new reality where he can't protect people the way he used to? And if you can't be the person who saves everyone, if you can't be the strongest, if you can't keep pushing past every limit, then who are you? That's the question that haunts people like him. Like Kakashi after losing everyone. Like Itachi after carrying the weight of his choices. Like every character in anime who sacrifices everything and then has to figure out how to live in the aftermath. Because the aftermath is where the real psychological battle happens. Not during the crisis, during the recovery. When everyone else moves on and you're still stuck processing what happened, what it cost, what it means. Most people don't talk about that part. They don't show you what happens after the hero moment. They don't explore the depression that follows the adrenaline, the emptiness that comes after you've given everything, the existential crisis of realizing your entire identity was built around something you can't do anymore. But that's the reality. That's what living with guilt-based trauma actually looks like in the long run. And if this hit deeper than you expected, if this felt less like analyzing an anime character and more like someone just described your own internal experience, there's a reason for that. Because Guy's story isn't unique. The specifics are different, sure. Most of us are ninja opening forbidden gates, but the psychology? The patterns? The way guilt shapes your entire life without you even realizing it? That's universal. That's human. That's the hidden truth running through so many people's lives that nobody wants to acknowledge, because acknowledging it means admitting how much pain we've been carrying, how long we've been pretending, how tired we actually are. And here's the thing most people won't tell you, there's another layer to Guy's pain. Something even darker, even more buried, even more invisible than everything we've already unpacked. It's the part about what happens when you finally stop running, when you're forced to sit still, when you can't distract yourself with training or missions or protecting others anymore, when you have to face the version of yourself you've been avoiding your whole life. That's where the deepest trauma lives. In the relationship you have with yourself when nobody else is watching. In the thoughts that surface when you're alone. In the truth you've been too scared to look at because looking at it would mean everything changes. Most people never get there. They stay in the cycle, keep the mask on, keep pushing, keep performing, until something breaks them open and forces them to face it. But the ones who do get there, the ones who finally stop and look, they realize the person they've been running from their whole life was never the enemy. The guilt was. The shame was. The belief that they had to earn their existence was. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Your entire life suddenly makes sense in a way it never did before. Every relationship, every choice, every moment of pain, they all line up into a pattern you've been living unconsciously for years. And that clarity? It's both devastating and liberating at the same time. Because now you know. Now you see. Now you understand why you've been exhausted for so long. And you have to decide, do you keep living that pattern or do you finally choose something different? That's the real cliffhanger. Not what happens to Guy in the story, but what happens to you after understanding his story. Because if you recognized yourself in this, if you saw your own guilt patterns, your own hyperfunctioning, your own mask, then this wasn't just about anime psychology anymore. This was about you. About the truth you've been carrying. About the choice you now have to make. And honestly, that's scarier than any villain, any battle, any dramatic plot twist. Because changing your relationship with guilt, with responsibility, with your own worth, that requires facing the darkest parts of yourself that you've been avoiding. And most people would rather keep fighting external battles than face that one. But the ones who do, the ones who finally turn around and look at what they've been running from, they're the ones who actually find peace. Not through more sacrifice, not through more proof, not through more pain, but through finally understanding, you were always enough. The guilt lied. The shame lied. The voice telling you that you had to earn your existence lied. You were always enough. You just couldn't see it through the weight you were carrying. And if you want to understand what that journey actually looks like, what it takes to dismantle those patterns, what's waiting on the other side of that guilt, you already know where to find me. Because this journey, we're just getting started.